I said, Caleb Preston Crandall. And yeah, I'm using this novel written by Harriet Wilson. It's the very first novel written by, or published by, a Black American woman in 1859. And it has a slur in the title, so I'm not going to be saying it, of course, but it is important, so just keep that in mind. So this is my thesis, or my abstract for my thesis anyway. I will read the full title, the extended title. It's "Were Sketches from the Life of a Free Black in a Two-Story White House North, Showing that Slavery Shadows Fall Even There." And my main thesis, the actual topic I'm doing, is I'm comparing Wilson to Harriet Jacobs, Sojourner Truth, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Harriet Tubman, and how they viewed both finding allies and the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Now, I presume that most people are aware of everyone in this list other than perhaps Harriet Wilson, but we'll get to that. So this is the novel that I'm using. This is the edition that I used. It's free online, you should read it, it's great. So the basic plot, since it's not particularly famous, it was rediscovered in the 80s, so probably not many people have read it. It is about a young biracial woman named Fredo, whose mother, Mag Smith, is white, who marries a black man named Jim. And when Jim dies, Fredo is sold into indentured servitude in the North. And it follows her life throughout her indentured servitude from the age of, up until the age of 18 and a little past. And she is tortured and beaten by the Belmont family. And it's considered autobiographical to a certain extent. It is a fictional story, it is a novel, but it is considered extraordinarily closely tied to Harriet Wilson's own life, which, speaking of which, here is Harriet Wilson herself. We are extremely fortunate to have a photograph of her. She was born in New Hampshire in Milford and died in Massachusetts in 1900. So we're very lucky and very fortunate to have this. Now, this is who I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of my presentation. I will mention everyone else who I talked about in my thesis just briefly, but this is really the main thing that I think people would find it most interesting. But as I said, I will mention other people, like Sojourner Truth. I feel like we probably all know Sojourner Truth, famous abolitionist, born into slavery in New York. This is probably her most famous quote. And of course, there's Harriet Tubman, who we all know, born into slavery in Baltimore, Maryland. Harriet Jacobs, who's born into slavery in North Carolina. And of course, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was born free in Baltimore. If you don't know who she was a poet and an essayist from Baltimore, as I mentioned. But as I said, we're mostly focusing on Harriet Wilson. This, to me, is where, first of all, where my title comes from, but it's the main point of the novel. Fredo, that is, was watched by kidnappers, maltreated by professed abolitionists. We will come back to this quote, it does become important again. So keep this quote in mind. Now, the first question we have to ask is, who was the intended audience? She does say that she has omitted what would most provoke shame in our good anti-slavery friends at home. However, as the previous quote would seem to suggest, this is perhaps not fully meant to be taken literally. She does not pull her punches throughout the novel. And she does also mention in the same preface that she is she's appealing, as she says, to her colored brethren universally for patronage. So she does intend for a mostly black audience. However, it is also important to note that the surviving original copies have been found in the homes of white abolitionists. That's just an interesting side note. But again, this was not a particularly popular novel. So there's also that level. So, one of the main themes throughout the book as well is being biracial. This is one of my personal favorite quotes. This is Fredo talking to Jack Belmont, the son of Mr. and Mrs. Belmont. She asks, "Who made your mother?" "God." "Did the same God that made her make me?" "Yes." "Well, then I don't like him." "Why not?" "Because he made her white and me black. Why didn't he make us both white?" And again, Harriet Wilson was herself biracial, and this is one of the main themes that she is playing with throughout the novel. So, this is one of the main things that she is trying to subvert. She is trying to subvert the common themes and tropes of abolitionist literature, of what Black American writers are supposed to write about or supposed to sound like. And this is one of the main things, letters of recommendation. You see this is an example here from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's collection of poems. The idea was that you have a white person, generally an abolitionist of good moral standing that people trust, and they would say something to the effect of, this is a person who you should trust, this is a person who is good at what they do, and you should trust their stories, you should listen to them. This is, as I said, an example from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, written by famous white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. They tend to have a fairly patronizing tone. In this, for this example, he points out that she's young, and because she's black, you should not judge her poetry too harshly. And Wilson had 3 such letters in the appendix of her novel, but it is widely believed that she actually wrote them herself. My personal favorite piece of evidence for that is one of the letters was signed by CDS, the initial CDS, which just so happens to be the legal abbreviation for colored indentured servant. And again, they tend to have a patronizing tone to them, and Wilson is really questioning, why were they necessary? Why was it needed for a white person to vouch for a black writer? So that's one of the main things that she's worried with. The other thing that she's talking about is the tragic octoroon trope, which, as you can see here, comes from this play, which is based on an earlier novel. This play came out the same year the book was published, in 1859, based on the Quadroon. The novel came out in 1856. And the idea of the tragic octoroon is you have a biracial young woman who is white passing, who is raised as a white woman in her father's household. She is raised and educated as a white woman. However, when her father dies, she finds that she is, legally speaking, enslaved, because slavery passes through the mother. So the idea behind it was white abolitionists in a white audience would be more receptive to a white passing, educated young woman as opposed to other people. So it was a way to kind of garner sympathy for the abolitionist cause. So again, Wilson herself, being biracial but not being white passing, is pretty well aware of this level of hypocrisy. And she has 2 characters who could really fit within that role to a certain extent. Fredo, our main character, who is described as beautiful, as biracial, as intelligent, and those all fit within the trope. However, she's not white passing. She's described very clearly as being noticeably black, and she is also not from a household that was from a white father and a black mother, which is the point of the trope. She comes from a household where she has a white mother and a black father. And speaking of her mother, Mag Smith, who is, again, white, she was described as mischievous, sexually promiscuous. She had a child out of wedlock, as being morally dubious. And again, these are all stereotypes that were used very commonly for black women. So Wilson is really subverting these ideas of white womanhood and what it means to be a woman, and especially a white woman, and therefore also a black woman. This is one of the most fascinating parts of this novel. And the last big thing that I find fascinating is her choice of naming the novel. So, as you can see, this is from the original title page. As you can see, it's both titled this, but it's also originally published under this pseudonym. She chose specifically to do this, partially because she wants to protect herself. She does not want to give her name freely, because she is basing this story off of her own life, and the people who she was indentured to were very much still prominent, wealthy members of the community, so she didn't want to put herself in any possible danger. But it also has a broader political claim. On one side, it's a way to make the story feel more real to our audience by having it be written by the person it's talking about, to make it seem more visceral. But it also allows for it to be discussion of the country, of the entire country. As we see from the extended title, the 2-story White House North is both a literal description of the Belmont home, a big 2-story White House. It's just a wealthy family's home. But it's also a metaphor for the United States itself, the North and the South being the 2-story White House. So it's a way of viewing slavery, the institution of slavery, as not strictly a Southern issue, but rather as an American issue, that abolitionists, white abolitionists, and white people in the North are also complicit and also profiting from the exploitation of black people and black labor. So again, we come back to this quote: watched by kidnappers, maltreated by professed abolitionists. This is, to me, again, as I said, the main point of the novel. The kidnappers from the South and the professed abolitionists of the North who didn't want slaves at the South nor in their own houses in the North. Harriet Wilson was claiming in 1859, in a time when the fugitive slave law was still law of the land, when she was oppressed already and even further oppressed, on the eve of the Civil War, only a few years away, went out and wrote this novel that was both critiquing slavery, of course, from an abolitionist point of view, but also critiquing white abolitionism. It is a truly remarkable and brave accomplishment for her to have done, and I'm very fortunate to have found this novel, and I would encourage everyone to read it. It is not very long, so thank you. Any questions? What was that?
It's free online.
It's free online. It is. It's free online. If you look it up, you'll find one. It's published by Trent Nottingham University.
I want to thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting and important. And I just had a question about the time period that we're discussing. During what years is she in indentured servitude?
So she was born in 1825, and she was indentured at a pretty young age, so around the 1830s up until about the 1840s or so. She spent most of her childhood up until until she was 18 years old. Yeah.
Okay.
I know from personal experience, it's one thing to write a book and another thing to get it published. Like, it takes money or a sponsor to like.
That is
still half the story.
That's one of the most interesting things, actually. I'm glad you asked that. So it was sponsored by a white abolitionist, but it was done extremely cheaply. And the original publication had a lot of printing issues. It was done by a company who didn't normally do novels. So it was actually, I forget exactly what their specialty was, but it was not novels. They did, I think, maybe newspapers or something to that effect. So it had a lot of printing issues, and it was done extremely cheaply. So there was a sponsor, and that did happen, but it was also a kind of iffy job at it. So I saw your hand. I'm sorry.
I was gonna ask, what was your thought process like dissecting the book, assuming you've read it more than one?
I've probably read it half a dozen times or more now. The first time I read it, I didn't know what to make of it. To be completely honest, I did not know. I was like, this. I can tell it's interesting. I can tell it's important, but I don't know what to make of it. And that's actually where I want to thank Dr. B.A., who was my content advisor, and she really helped a lot with my thought process on not on the novel specifically, just on abolitionism in general, and so that really helped me dissect the novel a little further, and it's helped me put it in context. That's why I chose to talk about the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 and finding allies, because those were common themes that I was seeing in my research of other people as well, so that's how that came about. And speaking of which, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on Dr. Hani's question and your response to it. In what ways do you, to me there's a story even there in the way that it ends up being published. When we think about this piece next to Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl, like if you wanted to think, since you're talking about Harriet Jacobs as well, when we think about how much money was pumped into publishing Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl versus this one, what do you think's happening there?
That's the thing that I find so fascinating, is because Harriet Jacobs also critiques Northern. I mean, there's a quote, I'm trying to remember it, but she talks about the fugitive slave law as well, and she says it's a strange incongruity for a state called supposedly free to allow such a law to come into play. So she also is critiquing Northern, like white abolitionists and the North more generally. But I think the difference is Harriet Wilson she really does not pull any punches. Yeah. She really, both in terms of critiquing slavery, but also critiquing white abolitionists. And that's the thing that makes her so different, is not to say that Harriet Jacobs is pulling punches, but that her focus is just different. And she's also coming from just a different perspective because she was from the South and from North Carolina, whereas Harriet Wilson is from up north in New Hampshire, so there is also that difference. So I think that is where that difference comes in terms of, as you say, of their publication and their reception.
I completely agree. I would add that I think a lot of it too is to do with the subversive elements in this.
Yes.
Whereas Harriet Jacobs becomes the archetype of these types of writings, she is subverting a lot of what Harriet Jacobs is playing into. And I think that's definitely a part of it too. Great job.
Well, thank you, Kayla.